Well, the project had its initial impetus from the judicial ban on affirmative action in Texas, but that affected the entire Fifth Circuit Court. It was motivated by a law school decision, but the solution to ban affirmative action, any consideration of race in any public or private institution affected, it had far-reaching consequences. So there was already a good deal of backlash to use of affirmative action in California and other states that people attributed to administrators and politicians to affirmative action, why some kids were not getting into college. So at the University of Texas, and a group of faculty and administrators got together and tried to come up with an alternative to maintain the hard-earned diversity in one of the most diverse states in the country. And they came up with this alternative, allegedly race-neutral plan, the top 10% law, that basically guaranteed admission to the top 10% of each high school class. And so the project was motivated by an interest in and an effort to evaluate whether, in fact, that was an efficient race-neutral alternative to affirmative action. So that was a narrow focus, but whenever you're going to launch a project whose scale I could not anticipate when I first began the pilot and the planning, it was important for us to cast the net broader, because that was a narrow focus for a specific policy evaluation that was embedded in broader issues of equity and access to college. Is particularly important given the inequality in Texas, which is now also mirrored in our country. We do have a lot of inequities in access to higher education and also in the outputs of our educational system. So we took a broader approach to education and higher education in the pipeline. It was started with a team of collaborative investigation involving Teresa Sullivan, who was at the time a vice chancellor at the University of Texas, and we were able to begin to investigate the questions by collecting data. It was important that we were not in Texas. I was not as principal investigator in the state because I didn't have an axe in the debate and could take a race neutral approach. So we were looking at college planning, college decision making, and equity and access. In this context, does the change in regime actually improve access for people who had been excluded, and how so, and how well do they do? So we took a very broad look. I think as I look back on the 10-year retrospective, there were three major issues that I think came to light in this through this research. One is that we have, as a society, policymakers and the litigators have focused on the admission decision. Who doesn't get in? But that's an institutional decision, and the issue of equity and access has not been framed more broadly in terms of the decision of the students to apply or not, and the decision of students to enroll conditioned on acceptance. But it's all been focused on the institutional decision, which has been litigated. One of the big findings was it matters who applies. And we were asking who doesn't apply, who is technically eligible. That question reared its head in important ways in Texas, because when you have many kids who are actually guaranteed admission, they've performed at the top of their class, and they're not applying. Given the demography of the state at the time the law was passed, if every top 10% student had actually applied to a public institution, they would have reached a saturation level. So that question hasn't been asked. And given the diversity of our population, even with the high dropout rates, focusing on the application pipeline is an important route to diversification that has not been explored. So that's one big lesson. The second lesson has to do with equity, and that is the meritocracy. We have investigated the top 10% is not the most efficient solution to diversify a campus. It's less efficient than affirmative action. However, the test scores have been used. They were devised as a mechanism for finding the aristocracy of talent, and they've become the mechanism of exclusion. The research showed that minority students were being excluded or considered inadmissible because they did not have the test scores. But test scores are actually an achieved ability, not an innate ability. And if by eliminating that requirement, we were able to examine the question, are students from these allegedly low-performing schools, but who perform at the top of their game in these schools, are they less qualified? Are they more likely or less likely to fail? And it turns out that the test scores are very poor predictors. We knew this, but only when you can actually compare it against the counterfactual of how do students who have lower test scores but have very high class rank, how do they actually perform? We showed that they actually outperformed their classmates. The descriptive findings that the universities were reporting based on just their results indicated that was the case, but we were actually able to subject this finding to very rigorous empirical scrutiny and multivariate modeling, and it held up. The challenge was then that it created a displacement of students from the competitive high schools in a state that underinvested in education. So the tension for the competition for slots continued, and the dialogue, the debate about who belongs and who doesn't belong, shifted from ascription, that is, race and ethnic groups who have lower test scores, to students from low-performing schools who shouldn't be admitted or given priority over second-tier students, that is, second decile, who came from very competitive high schools. So basically the argument, the debate about who belongs, who doesn't, merit and their meritocracy, just shifted from individuals to schools as units of analysis, which brings to the third big finding, and that is that high school, the quality of high schools matters a great deal. It matters not only for who applies, it matters for who actually gets into college, and we have shown that the quality of the high school has lasting effects on academic performance. So that you can show that if we randomly distributed students, minorities, non-minorities, rich students, poor students, to high schools, rather than had the systematic stratification by race, ethnicity, and social class, that the performance would be equal to, that minorities will not underperform. So once you compare non-minority with minority within the same high school, it turns out that the minority students outperform once again. So that the inequities that we find in places that come up with statewide criteria versus school-specific criteria for admission shows that it's the inequities across schools rather than the abilities and the talents and the drive and motivation of children, of students to succeed in college. We've had a very hard time in social sciences to demonstrate how powerful are school effects in carrying through lifelong consequences, and we've been able to find quite compelling evidence in terms of what college choice sets students make, how limited they are depending on what school they go to, and whether they even apply, and furthermore how well they do, conditional on they would outperform rather than underperform if you do a comparison of students who had the same opportunity. So minority status has been created through inequities of opportunity. Well, Texas is a very unequal state, and Texas is a state that underinvested in higher education. So all the allegations about affirmative action being the cause of non-admissibility or who was not getting in of the so-called deserving students was really driven by the fact that the state underinvested in higher education. So there was a squeeze put on the state because the demography, that is, the college-eligible cohorts, were growing far faster than the expansion of post-secondary education in the state. What we discovered is that even before the Hopwood decision in '96, already the faster growth and the number of slots, of seats in post-secondary already surpassing the two-year system. So Texas is unique in this regard in as much as most of the growth has been driven by two-year colleges. But they have had an expansion in the four-year college system, has not even begun to keep pace with the demographic growth. Add to that today, Texas is a majority-minority state, and almost two-thirds of its school-age population is minority today. That it ranks 43rd in the nation in terms of educational outputs. You have a large, it's one of the fastest growing states in terms of its age structure because of it's a very young population, will continue to grow even as some of the other states have already begun to slow. That college peak that we've been predicting, the baby boom echo, in Texas is going to go on a lot longer because of the echo of immigration that compounded this. When you put these factors together, you have this perfect storm of demography, underinvestment in education, and high inequality that is going to toll hardest on the Hispanic population, because Hispanics are the largest share of the population in Texas. So in Texas, you have further collision course between the elderly and the young. You have a growth of the young population at a time that, as a nation, we're aging. For public policy, the programs for the elderly are predominantly federally funded, and we keep taking out higher debt ceilings to cover them, Social Security and Medicare. For the young, the programs are state funded. So where states have to balance their budgets, unlike the federal government. So because states balance their budgets, and must do so, then what happens is they're making their cuts in education precisely at a time that the Hispanics are coming of age. So they're coming of age in an aging society. They're coming of age in a society that's in fiscal crisis, that's going to then put them at higher risk than ever in the history for underinvestment in education at a time that it's most needed. It's going to toll hard on the state because they're going to pay in terms of lost productivity. It's going to toll on the Hispanic population in that they're going to compete for the bottom at a time that that we need more talent, more educated population, and that they're becoming a larger share of the total.